Hi, welcome back to We All Scream, another true crime podcast. I'm your host, Lisa, and today I'm telling you a terrible story about the murders of 4 women whose lives were taken way before their time by a sick and sadistic man. While some people have blamed the trauma brought on by his brother's kidnapping that lasted 7 years, the truth is he had fantasies about abducting and murdering women since he was only 7 years old. In February of 1999, Carole Sund, Joie Sund, and Silvina Pelosso were staying at Cedar Lodge in El Portal, which has been described as a rustic, beautiful place 7 miles outside of Yosemite National Park's entrance. Carole, 42 years old, and Julie, 15 years old, were mother and daughter duo, while Silvina, 16 years old, was from Argentina and staying with the Sunds as a foreign exchange student. When Carole was in high school, she was actually a foreign exchange student and lived with Silvina's mom, Raquel, and her family for 6 months in Argentina. Raquel and Carole were only 1 year apart and immediately became good friends. Before Carole left Argentina, she and Raquel exchanged rings made from Black Hills gold and promised each other to meet again. Over the years, they would send letters as well as birthday and Christmas cards, and they even married around the same time. And Silvina and Julie, well, they were born only a year apart. So Carole and her husband Jens and Julie all visited Argentina when Julie was just a toddler. They stayed for 2 months, and when they left, Carole gave Raquel her gold ring back, and Raquel promised she would return the ring to Carole when she visits her someday in California, but unfortunately that would never happen. Carole, Julie, and Silvina left the Sund home in Eureka, California on February 12, 1999. They flew to San Francisco where they rented a red 1999 Pontiac Grand Prix. And I don't know if you know, but those were pretty cool back in the day. Their first stop was the University of Pacific, where Julie had a cheerleading competition. From there, they headed to Cedar Lodge and arrived at the inn early on February 14th, where they reserved a room for 3. The next day, they hiked and toured the park, and that evening they dined at the restaurant attached to the Cedar Lodge, and later they rented a couple movies from the lodge's service desk to bring back to their room. The plan was to drive to the San Francisco airport, where they would return the car that they rented, meet Jens at the airport, and then all 4 would fly back together to Phoenix, where Jens had a business meeting. And the meeting is actually why Jens wasn't able to accompany the ladies on the trip to Yosemite. He needed time to prepare for this meeting. But while Jens was in the meeting, the ladies were going to tour the Grand Canyon. When the 3 didn't show up to the airport, Jens thought they must have flown ahead of him. When he didn't find them in Phoenix, he was sure he must have misheard the instructions. So he stayed the night in Phoenix and woke up the next morning, played a round of golf, and when Carole had still not contacted him, he decided that he probably better get the police involved. At first, police thought they could have gotten lost on the hiking paths or ran off a winding road due to that time of year being cold and drizzly. But when they weren't found within the first few days, they suspected something more sinister. This was the biggest search and rescue in Yosemite's National Park's history, and it ended up lasting for 4 weeks. Rescue volunteers were searching by both air and foot. They even had a Navy P-2 plane flying overhead looking for metal. The room the women stayed in was searched, and while a pillowcase and a pink blanket seemed to be missing, all that was found was wet towels in the bathroom, left behind food, and a movie they had rented. It looked like they had woken up, showered, and left the inn. Family and friends were interviewed and quickly ruled out as suspects. And then early on, an employee of Cedar Lodge was brought in for questioning. His van, belongings, and his locker all contained a dark red substance that looked like it could be dried blood. The dark red substance was tested, and it turned out to be rust. 4 days after the girls disappeared, Carole's wallet turned up nearly 100 miles away from Cedar Lodge on a suburban street in Modesto, California. It still contained all of Carole's credit cards and some cash. Thousands of leads came in that went nowhere. It wasn't until March 18th of 1999 that solid, tangible evidence came in. In Mowook Village, I might be saying that wrong, California, 89 miles away from Cedar Lodge, where the trio stayed, and 62 miles away from Modesto, where Carole's wallet was found, a hunting guide scouting for deer stumbled upon a charred car with melted tires backed up into a tree line on an old logging road. The California Highway Patrol ran the license plate, and it came back to the 1999 Grand Prix Carole had rented. FBI agents arrived on scene the morning of the 19th and searched what was left of the vehicle. The car was now a gunmetal gray color because the red paint had literally melted off of the car in the fire. It was estimated the fire had reached 25 feet into the air, reaching temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. When they were able to look inside the trunk, their worst fear came true. There were 2 bodies burned beyond recognition. Like skull fragments were the only body parts that were really recognizable. And within a few days, they were able to identify the bodies in the trunk as belonging to Carole and Silvina. But where was Julie? Family and investigators held out hope she was still alive and continued their search. Not far from the car, a camera was found that contained photos of the girls and Carole on their trip. Julie and Silvina are arm in arm in front of a waterfall with granite cliffs in the background. Another shows Silvina in her pajamas and Carole sitting on their unmade beds inside their cedar lodge room. The girls ice skating, Carole and Silvina standing by a trail, as well as more photos capturing Carole, Julie, and Silvina just having fun on their sightseeing vacation. After reviewing all the photos, they found the last ones were taken the evening of February 15th. A week later, authorities at the Modesto Resident Agency received an envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map on lined notebook paper of Lake Don Pedro, which is located 60 miles west of Cedar Lodge, where the trio was staying, 47 miles south of Wewook Village, where the burned-out car was found, and 30 miles east of where Carole's wallet was found. The map showed a trail from Highway 120 to an X drawn along the lake shore. The most disturbing part of the handwritten map were the words scrawled at the top that read, "We had fun with this one." When FBI agents and their cadaver dog from LA followed the map, the badly decomposed remains of Julie were found at the bottom of a hill covered in brush. Her throat had been cut. Police figured whoever was responsible for the deaths of Carole, Julie, and Silvina had to be familiar with the area due to where the abandoned car was found. The area was known as a dump site for the locals, like older refrigerators, washers, dryers, and cars. Some locals would even burn garbage there. So it wasn't surprising no one noticed the smoke or smells from the burning rental car. Task Force set up local agencies to try to solve this case and make sure the threat was addressed and removed for the sake of the community. A lot of DNA was on the envelope that contained the map to Julie's body. It was tested and came back belonging to a person of Spanish origin. By the end of June, authorities had men they considered to be the main murder suspects. Although they had not yet been charged related to the murders, they were behind bars on outstanding warrants for other crimes. Everyone in the area seemed to feel relieved and felt as if they could let their guard down, now that police were, sure that the murderers were in custody. But on July 21st, 1999, just 3 weeks after locals and tourists felt safe again, Joie Armstrong, a 26-year-old Yosemite Institute naturalist, was reported missing by a friend in Sausalito, California, when she failed to show up for a planned camping trip on the central California coast. Joie lived in an unmarked road in Foresta, California. There were 30 cabins inhabited by park employees scattered across the bottom of a wooded glen. Joie lived with her boyfriend, who was also a Yosemite Institute naturalist, as well as a second roommate. They shared a green cabin that was secluded at the edge of the meadow. Joie paid $1 a year to the Park Service to live there. Her job was to introduce the beauty of the park and nature to children. Joie's white pickup truck was parked in the driveway, loaded up with her luggage for her trip. Yellow police tape went up around the area of the cabin, and the search began. Inside of the cabin, the only things that seemed to be out of the ordinary were a pair of broken sunglasses and a red mechanic's rag. After only a few minutes into their search, they noticed footprints, trampled ferns, and grass, and then something metallic. In a ditch filled with 3 feet of water was a key ring, and just beyond it was a woman's body dressed in a white t-shirt and blue jeans. As they drew closer, they realized she had been decapitated. Her head would later be found several feet away from her body. Authorities were sure there was no connection with the Sund Pelosso murders and kept the key suspects of the case behind bars. The crime scene near the cabin was sloppy. There were footprints and tire marks, whereas the Sund Pelosso murders involved multiple crime scenes with little evidence left. There was a tip that came in almost immediately, though. A park employee had noticed a blue and white 1979 International Scout parked near Joie's cabin the night of her murder. On July 22nd, 2 rangers spotted the Scout parked on the shoulder of I-40 in the Merced River Canyon, which was about 12 miles from the western entrance of the park. As they descended the rocky riverbank in search of the owner of the vehicle, they came across a decently handsome man who was smoking a joint and sunbathing in the nude. He was calm and identified himself as Carrie Stainer, a 37-year-old man who worked at the local Cedar Lodge as a handyman. After seizing his marijuana, searching his vehicle, confiscating his backpack, and bringing him into the station for some questioning, he was released in the early morning hours of July 23rd and was told not to leave El Portal because they might have some more questions for him. That day, the FBI investigators realized the tire tracks at the crime scene matched up with the photos that were taken of Stainer's tire treads. A bolo, be on the lookout, went out for Carrie Stainer. Carrie was spotted 2 days later when a tip came in from Laguna del Sol, a clothing-optional resort located nearly 3 hours northwest of where Joey's body had been found. He struck up a conversation with a woman who had seen the bolo earlier in the day, and he had talked about how things weren't going great with her, but he was headed north to start all over. She remained calm, finished out their conversation, and then immediately reported him to the authorities as soon as she could. When detectives arrived at the resort, they were told Carrie was eating lunch inside the restaurant and they could easily find him inside a corner booth because he was the only one wearing clothing. As soon as Carrie saw detectives walk in, he stood up, put his hands up. Detective Joe Renick thought that was an odd gesture considering he was still under the impression Carrie was only a witness or a potential victim, and he was fleeing out of fear for his own safety. Someone at the command post failed to mention that the crime scene tire tracks matched Carrie's vehicle's tires to Renick. Or maybe he just missed that part? Question mark? Either way, Renick asked Carrie if he could take him to the FBI office and ask him some questions, and he would bring him back to Laguna del Sol when they were done. Carrie agreed. It was a long ride to the station. Renick treated Carrie as if he was a witness because, well, they needed his cooperation and statement, and also he just kind of thought he was a witness. And so after handcuffing him behind his back, he sat Carrie in the front passenger seat of the Thunderbird and headed towards the FBI office. The two got to talking, and Renick asked if Carrie was in any relation to Stephen Stainer, a boy who had been abducted and missing for 7 years before he returned home at the age of 14. He confirmed Stephen was his younger brother, and Renick was very sympathetic to Carrie's feelings on the matter. Stephen's kidnapper and abuser only received 7 years, and Carrie wanted Renick's opinion on whether or not he thought it was a just sentence. Renick told him absolutely not. They seemed to bond at that moment. Renick even offered to get therapy and counseling for Carrie and his parents if they wanted it. Carrie told him when Stephen came home, it wasn't all sunshine and flowers like the nation wanted it to be. His behavior was different, he was disruptive to the family, and was living a lifestyle that was risky. Stephen was killed in an accident when a car hit his motorcycle and left the scene. The guy fled to Mexico and was eventually taken back to California, where they charged him with a misdemeanor and let him go. Clearly that upset Carrie, and they talked about how it wasn't fair. The conversation wasn't all doom and gloom. They also joked around a lot during their drive. Once they arrived back at the FBI office, Renick uncuffed Carrie and made sure he knew he was free to leave at any time. They put him in an unsecured interview room, then went to the night desk, which was in a secured area, to find out what they were supposed to do because no one had given them any direction. Head of the office was there and said he wanted Carrie interviewed, but then left for a news conference without telling them what they were supposed to interview Carrie about. So at this point, Renick just wanted to get home to his wife and figured the fastest way to do that and get an interview would be to call in their polygrapher, so they did. And while they were waiting, he figured everyone was hungry, so they ordered some pizza. He went back into the interview room with Carrie and started asking him questions about his background to kill some time because, again, they didn't know what they were supposed to be asking him. So when they asked questions until they couldn't come up with any more questions, neither the polygrapher or the pizza had shown up. So they took Carrie to their mugshot room and fingerprint area and took pictures of him and the bottom of his shoes. So while they were finishing up their photos, the pizza and polygrapher arrived. They asked Carrie if he wanted to eat or take the test first, and he said, "Let's skip the test. I want to talk to Renick alone." He took Carrie back to the unsecured room and went to find a couple of his colleagues and was like, "What am I supposed to do?" And they were like, see what he wants? That's a no-brainer. So when Renick returned, Carrie was sitting hunched over, sort of facing a corner. He told Rennick he had done terrible things. He went on to say at times he felt like the world was at peace, and other times that he could kill everyone in the world. He told him he had never told anyone before, but he was molested by his uncle when he was 12 years old, and he's never really gotten over it. Carrie then said he could answer some questions about Joie and more. Another agent then knocked on the door holding pizza, and Rennick invited him to stay. They were sitting around eating pizza when Carrie said, "This is going to be my last meal as a free man," and then told the detectives he had 3 things he wanted in order for him to tell them what he knows. The first one was child pornography. The second was that he knew there was a $275,000 reward and he wanted it to go to his family. And the third, he wanted to be housed in a new federal prison that was being built near where his family lived. When the detectives asked him which one he would pick if he had to pick one, he chose the child pornography. The detective told him he didn't see that happening, so they just kind of moved on and skipped over that subject. Carrie told Rennick he went to Foresta because he regularly looked for Bigfoot. As he was looking around, he noticed a petite woman with pigtails going in and out of her cabin while she was loading her truck. He then started watching her, but told Rennick he was doing research. Personally, I'd have to call that stalking. I digress. Carrie said he then went to his truck to get his kit, which consisted of a .22 revolver, rope, duct tape, a serrated kitchen knife, and a camera. He then went up to Joie, who was still loading her truck, and started making conversation with her about Bigfoot and if she lives alone, talking about how well the cabin was fixed up. And at one point, she turns to step up on the porch, and when her back is to him, he pulled out the revolver, put it to her head, and tells her he's not there to hurt her. He's just desperate for money and her cooperation, and then he'll leave. He obviously had way more sinister ideas in mind, but he knew he needed to lie in order to get her to cooperate long enough to get her where he wanted her and to be able to gain control. He walked her to the back bedroom of the cabin, and that's where he duct taped her hands behind her back and gagged her. Joie didn't make it easy for him, though. She resisted and fought the whole time. He then led her out of the house by an arm, went to her truck, and took the keys that were in the hatch and closed the door. She continued to resist as he took her to his truck that was parked nearby and threw her in the back seat. When Joie sees where he's taking her, she knows she's in trouble, so she starts kicking and fighting to get out. It manages to launch herself headfirst out of the passenger side window that was rolled down. Carrie slammed the truck in park, and by the time he jumped out, she was already up and started running towards an asphalt road. She knew there were cabins off that road, and if someone happened to be looking out of a window or sitting on the deck, they would see what was going on and intervene. But Carrie caught up to her before she could get very far. She still continued to fight him despite being tied up. They were still in plain view, so he dragged her to the side of a hill. He took the knife that was in his back pocket and was able to slit her throat despite Joey's attempt to stop the knife by pinning her chin down to her chest. He then moved her another 10 to 15 feet until they were completely out of sight from the road. And he drug her down to a little canal by some bushes and left her there before going to his truck and parking it off of the road. Carrie walked back down to Joey's lifeless body and used his knife to behead her. He briefly thought about keeping her head, but instead bathed her head in the creek, washing the blood off of her face and out of her hair. After he was finished, he placed her head in the creek a few hundred feet from her decapitated body. Then he threw Joey's keys and the knife he had used to kill her with into the woods as far as he could. Shortly after returning to his truck, while he was still on Joey's road, he noticed one of his tires was flat, and a park ranger actually ended up stopping to help him out. When Carrie was done talking about Joey, Rennick let him know they were not going to let him look at child pornography, so he needed to decide what he wanted to do. Rennick told Carrie he could already see the relief in him and that he already looked better. He told him he's here to help him get through it if he wanted to, and he would keep his word about preparing his family. But depending on how long Carrie took to make the decision, he would take his time getting to them. He sat quietly for a minute before he looked up and said, "Okay, let's do it." He told Rennick he had prepared for over a year to commit the crimes. He started watching police shows. He knew about DNA and trace evidence. Carrie told Rennick how he is committed to carrying out a sexual fantasy of killing the guardian of 2 12 or 13-year-old girls and sexually abusing the little girls before killing them. His original plan had been to murder his girlfriend, sexually assault her daughters, who were 8 and 11 years old, and then kill them as well. Carrie was at their house on February 14th, ready to carry out his hideous fantasy, but luckily for his girlfriend and her daughters, a guy was there working around the property, and he couldn't get away with what he was wanting to do with them there, so he eventually left and went back home. But he was really fired up. He had been planning and preparing to carry out this sick fantasy for a year, and just when, he finally thought it was about to happen, he was unable to carry it out. He went back to Cedar Lodge and grabbed the master keys because he wanted to relax in the jacuzzi, but when he approached the water, he realized it hadn't been maintained. So he serviced the jacuzzi and then started walking in the parking lot. He knew there was a room with several girls, but he had ruled them out earlier when he noticed a guy was with them. Luckily for them, what he didn't know was the guy had actually left earlier. But when he reached the 500 building, he noticed a red car parked all by itself. It was a Monday, and most guests had checked out the day before. Also, the 500 building was the furthest from the main office. Through an open curtain into room 509, he sees Carole, Julie, and Silvina hanging out and realizes there isn't a man with him. So he decides this was it. So he went to the office, pretended to return the master keys, then went to his room and grabbed his backpack, also known as his murder kit. Carrie walked up to room 509 and knocked on the door. Carole opened the window and asked him what he needed. He told them, he's the maintenance man. He needed to check out their bathroom because the bathroom above them had been leaking. Carole was like, absolutely not. The girls were already in their pajamas and they had a movie going. But Carrie persisted, telling Carole they'd have to change rooms. So she eventually agreed to let him in to check out the bathroom. Not that it mattered. He still had the master keys and could have let himself in at any time. He walked past the trio and went into the bathroom. When he came out, he pulled his gun out and told them he only wanted money and the keys to the car. The girls were on the bed closest to the door. Carole turned around to get into her purse to grab the money, but he told her to get back on the bed and he'd get it. All three were ordered face down on the bed so he could tie their hands behind their backs. Once he was finished, he led the girls into the bathroom where he instructed them to sit on the floor. He then closed the bathroom door and set his sights on Carole. He took a piece of rope and strangled her to death before taking her body out to the red Pontiac Grand Prix she had rented and put her body into the trunk. When he went back into room 509, he had the girls come out of the bathroom where he tore and cut off their clothes before sexually assaulting them. Silvina was crying a lot and refused to participate, while Julie tried to stay calm and was cooperative with him. When he realized Silvina wasn't going to participate, he brought her into the bathroom where he put her in the bathtub and strangled her to death. He then went back out to Julie and continued to sexually assault her. He had convinced himself that because Julie was cooperating that she actually liked him. Carrie made sure to tell the detective she did everything that he told her to do without her crying or him having to beat her. Julie needed to go to the bathroom, but he didn't want her to see Silvina in the tub, so he took her to room 510 next door and told her to shave herself. While she was doing that, he moved Silvina's body to the trunk beside Carole. Around 5 a.m, Carrie told Julie they had to go someplace and reassured her he wouldn't hurt her. Her hands were duct taped in front of her at this point, and he wrapped a pink motel blanket around her body, placed her in the red Grand Prix, and started driving. He said he didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do at that point, but he stopped by the office to drop off the master keys for real this time, then hopped onto Route 49 and headed north. He's telling her how much he loves her and wants to keep her, but at the same time, he knows he has to get rid of the car and bodies and eventually, Julie. Carrie finally pulled into a parking area at Lake Don Pedro and parked, then carried her back to a spot in the brush. He explained it to detectives that he carried her like a husband carries a bride over the threshold. He spread out the pink blanket, placed her on it, and sat beside her, making conversation about the sun coming up. Not long after, he has her sit up on her knees, then comes up from behind her and cuts her throat. It wasn't effective, though, and it didn't do anything except cause Julie a lot of pain. So much pain that she held her hand to her head, gesturing for him to shoot her. He told her there were never any bullets in the gun, so he couldn't shoot her. He ended up cutting her throat again, and that time it worked. He took her down the hill, covered her up, and then he jumped back in the car and was throwing stuff out of the car, getting rid of evidence, or attempting to. He got back onto Route 49, still headed north, then merged onto Route 108, which headed east, and stopped off at Miwok Village, where he dumped the car off of the logging road. Carrie had $200 that he took from Carole's purse, and he caught a cab to Yosemite Lodge, which was just down the road from Cedar Lodge, where he lives. He was exhausted, so he slept for a while, and when he woke up, he loaded a couple gallons of gasoline into his Scout and headed back to the rental car. He doused it with gasoline, leaving the rear passenger door open to act as a wind funnel. Carrie said as the car started burning, the horn went off and he was afraid it would draw attention. Once he was sure the car had burned, he drove back to Modesto, where Carole's wallet would later be found. He then starts worrying about Julie's body being left out in the wilderness and decides to draw a map and send it to the FBI. So he goes by the store, he buys paper, envelopes, cotton gloves, and cups. Then he finds a Hispanic kid outside of a fast food restaurant and tells the kid he needs his saliva because he has a paternity test and he doesn't want them to know it's his kid. So he had this kid spit in a cup and then he used it to seal the envelope, which explains why the lab found Hispanic DNA on the envelope that contained the map. Carrie sobbed when he talked about Julie. He said he loved her and he believed she loved him because she was so cooperative. He was trying to figure out ways to keep her, and he told her he loved her and he told her there were never any bullets in his gun. When asked to write apology letters to all of his victims, he only wrote to one victim, Julie. Dear Julie, there are not enough words in the universe, nor days left in my life, to express to you how sorry I am for what I have done to you, your mother, and your friend. My weakness to control my evil desire has led us both to this crossroad. You, on one hand, have crossed over to a place of which I now can only dream of going, and I am going someplace far worse. My thoughts of you are a very sweet young woman who had a wonderful life ahead of her, but as it turns out, I destroyed any hopes of that. No more days with your family and friends, no more breaths of fresh air, no more sun shining on your face, and no more dreams of a life to be. All of it thrown away like yesterday's trash. My memories of your last few seconds of life will haunt me till the day I die, and rightfully so. The things I told you before I ended your life are things I've never been able to say to anyone else. Perhaps it was fear of rejection, or perhaps it was just plain fear of love, an emotion I have never experienced from anyone but my parents. But I can't blame any emotion or lack of emotion for what I did. I know right from wrong, and I don't think that I am insane, but there is a craziness that lurks in my head. Thoughts I have tried to subdue as long as I can remember. I'm just sorry that you were there when the years of fantasizing my darkest dreams became a reality in the flesh. Stainer pleaded guilty to premeditated first-degree murder, felony first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted aggravated sexual abuse resulting in death for Joie, and was sentenced to life without parole. He pleaded not guilty by insanity to the murders of Carole, Julie, and Silvina. The defense argued the family had a history of sexual abuse and mental illness, which caused Carrie to carry out the murders and led Stainer to request child pornography in exchange for his confession. A doctor testified Stainer had obsessive-compulsive disorder, mild autism, and paraphilia, which is a sexual interest in anything other than a legally consenting human partner. Still, he was found sane and convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and 1 count of kidnapping by a jury on August 27, 2002, and he was sentenced to death. He has been at San Quentin State Prison on death row since 2002. Silvina arrived in Eureka in late 1998 and lived with the Sunds as an exchange student. She took tough science and math classes at Eureka High School and played basketball. She was an expert roller skater back home and immediately took to ice skating and snowboarding when she arrived in the United States. Julie attended Eureka High School and was a cheerleader. She was an all-American girl with a typical teenage personality. One minute she wanted to be treated like a little girl, and the next minute she wanted to be treated like a grown-up. She was an older sister to 3 younger siblings. Carole and Jens met at Montgomery High School in Santa Rosa and were married in 1978. They actually honeymooned in Yosemite. Carole was described as an amazing friend and a positive person. She was a CASA, which stands for a Court-Appointed Special Advocate, and a CASA is a community volunteer who speaks up for the best interest of abused and neglected children. She was a passionate mother, and a few years after the birth of Julie, she and Jens adopted 3 children. She served on the board of the Council of Adoptable Children as well as the Service Review Team, which is a child welfare service. Joie was a German native who grew up in California and worked as a naturalist at the Yosemite Institute. She graduated from California State University. Joie strived to be the best person she could be. She was an adventurous environmentalist who would be the first to nag you if you weren't recycling or shame you for using styrofoam. She was a vegetarian and loved working in her garden. She'd water it using buckets of water from a nearby creek. Well, that's the terrible story I have for you this week. I will see you next time, and remember, trust no one.